It was one of the most ferocious sea battles of World War II when HMAS Perth confronted the might of the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Sunda Strait. 355 Australian sailors died when the Perth sank in 1942. It's now emerged this historic ship is being stripped by bounty hunters off the coast of Java. In a moment, we'll speak with a naval expert and author of a book about HMAS Perth. But first, Linton Besser has this exclusive story.
For 71 years, HMAS Perth has laid at rest, relatively undisturbed between the Indonesian islands of Sumatra and Java. But a couple of months ago, professional divers made a shocking discovery. The wreck is being systematically raided by scrap merchants, stripping the vessel of steel, copper and brass.
They're putting down a claw, a salvage claw, and ripping her to pieces.
In October, this crane was caught stripping a Dutch submarine off the coast of Malaysia. Divers have confirmed they've seen a similar vessel nearby the site of the Perth. The news has devastated survivors like Gavin Campbell.
If the Navy and the government have been aware of it, shame on them for not taking action to stop it.
In 1942, the light cruiser was sent north to meet the invading forces of the Japanese Navy. One night in February, after a spectacular firefight, the Perth was hit.
It was right in the throes of battle, of course. Then these torpedoes hit and the ship lurched. I was blown into the air. I have a sensation of just falling.
Just 216 of the 686 on board made it home. Most went down in the Perth, and there are remains of those sailors still in the wreckage.
Canberra needs to claim this ship as a war grave.
Andrew Fock is an expedition diver who has seen the wreck close up.
I felt gutted when I first saw what was going on. I mean, all ships collapse over a period of time when they're underwater, but to see it ripped up like that was, very moving.
Both Defence and the Department of Environment were told in September the Perth was being plundered for scrap and were urged to take action. So far, there's been little sign of it. Linton Besser, ABC News.
Well, joining me now from Canberra is military historian Dr. Catherine Spurling. She's a visiting scholar at ANU's School of History and spent 12 years working for the Australian Defence Force Academy. Her book, Cruel Conflict, The Triumph and Tragedy of HMAS Perth, was published in 2008. Catherine Spurling, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Can I ask you first for your reaction to that news that significant wartime wrecks like HMAS Perth are being stripped for scrap metal?
I think it's appalling, and it's just atrocious that the Australian government and the Indonesian government are allowing this to happen. Just before I came into the studio, I rang two of the other survivors. You've interviewed Gavin Campbell, who is one of them. There are only about 5 still alive. And I interviewed one called David Manning, and he said it's disgusting, and he's trying to write letters to the ministers to... This is a war grave. It has to be treated as every other Commonwealth war grave is treated. As you've mentioned, there are 350 men in the vicinity or below. I also spoke to Frank McGovern, whose brother Vincent was on the ship. Frank managed to get off the ship because in those days the Navy actually put brothers on the ship. And he said to me, you can quote me, Catherine, they're a load of bastards. And his brother is somewhere in that wreck because the hatches were buckled in the battle and these men could not escape from the engine room and various parts of the ship that were quite down below.
OK, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the story of the HMAS Perth, but just first of all, before we do that, in that report we heard the call being made for the wreck to be declared a war grave. Should that be done, and what difference would that make?
If it's made a war grave, surely then it has to be, it's a sanctioned place. It's not to be disturbed. There are people in that ship, or what may remain of them, since 1942. However, this is the grave of 300 plus men. So we have to treat it like we treat any other war grave. And the Australian government really has to act immediately because we have known that the salvage operations have been going on for some time. As Andrew Fox said, he has dived on it, and I've seen his video of it. And we know that things have been happening for this time. They've had plenty of time to think about this, and there are other situations like this. We have a submarine. Our first submarine disappeared with all hands in 100 years ago, and we still haven't found it off New Guinea. That has 35 men on board. When are we going to say, this is a war grave? We've got to think of the descendants of these people. They have had no closure, and they are very sensitive, and justifiably so, that these men should be treated with respect.
Okay, as you mentioned, hundreds of lives were lost in that engagement. Can you tell us a little bit more about HMAS Perth and how it came to be sunk in the Sunda Strait?
There were 681 on board the cruiser, and it had participated in the Battle of Java Sea. It was sent up from Australia as the Dutch East Indies were collapsing. It actually was a very bad political decision. Singapore had already been fallen before the ship was even sent. So the Australian government didn't make a very good decision on that one. And these men were caught, the ship was caught with the USS Houston in this battle. And the Dutch ships, there was an armada of Dutch, British, Australian and one American ship in the Battle of Java Sea. USS Houston and HMAS Perth were the only two ships to escape. So they then tried to escape back through Sunda Strait, and the Dutch intelligence said that there was nothing in the Sunda Strait. Unfortunately, there was an armada of Japanese ships about to land on Java and Batavia and every other part of the Dutch East Indies, and HMAS Perth and its crew put up a magnificent battle. They were so outgunned. In fact, one of the survivors said to me it was like a barroom brawl. We could even see the whites of the other people's eyes. They were pounded. The ship was eventually sunk by 4 torpedoes, and USS Houston sank quite shortly afterwards. And these men, the ones that went straight down with the ship, others were carried out to sea in the dreadful currents, and so many were lost in the waters. And some got ashore, but 106 died as POWs, including about 45 on the Rakea Maru, which was actually sunk after the Burma Tile Railway, because these men served on the Burma Tile Railway. As far as I'm concerned, they were heroes. They survived the Burma Tile Railway. Then they were put on Japanese transports to go to Japan as slave labour. And unfortunately, one of them was sunk by US submarines. And so 106 died as POWs through all various stages. So 214 came back to Australia out of 681. But we have to respect and commemorate those men who died and are still in the ship.
It's almost impossible today to grasp the heavy toll of that period. In that time, in those months, February and March of 1942, hundreds of Australian lives were lost at sea within a very short period. Around 20 British and Australian ships sunk within a week or so.
Yes, absolutely. It was probably the worst chapter in our naval history, actually, that over that first few months we had a terrible time. And of course, Sydney went down in November as well. So, you know, we were being battered pretty badly, and there was a few decisions that could have been made better. But nonetheless, that still cannot detract from the amazing attempts to save their ship that these men made. And they were so young. They were 18, 19, 20, you know, most of them were just mere boys. And so we really must get the Australian government immediately to say, hey, you can't do this. This is our ship, and these are our people, and we need to care for them. And the Indonesian government really has to respect that as well and say, you can't do this sort of thing, and somebody has to police this immediately. You
talk about all the bodies that remain within the wreck of that ship. Anyone familiar with the story of HMAS Perth will well remember the name of one of the best known and most highly regarded naval leaders of the Second World War, Australian naval leaders, Captain Heck Waller. He was known as Fighting Heck Waller. He was in command of the HMAS Perth that night and went down with his ship. It was, I guess, somewhat ironic to read today that a captain who was famous for being part of the scrap iron flotilla at Tobruk now has his final resting place being torn apart for scrap.
Yes. Yes, and he decided, the last he was seen was standing with his arms folded on the bridge, what was left of the bridge, because the bridge had been shattered. And he just believed he had to go down with his ship. He'd seen so many of his men just destroyed by gunfire. And he just said, I have to go. And he just stood there and went down with the ship. Yes, and he was a hero. Indeed he was. He was one of the most decorated of our sea Australian naval officers in World War II.
And Catherine Spurling, do you think Australians today have a good enough understanding of the sacrifices that were made by Australians at that time at sea fighting the Japanese in Australian ships, as well as on land with the Australian Army and in other engagements?
No, not at all. And I'm happy that we've actually seemed to be getting more of the human approach into our military history rather than me talking about things and commanding officers, because it's the fellows at the pointy end who get affected most, and we mustn't forget about the families they leave behind. As I just mentioned at the beginning of this interview, Frank McGovern. He survived the ship and he was made a POW. He survived Rakei Maru when it was sunk by Japanese submarines. He survived being a POW in Japan when the Americans were bombing Tokyo. But his brother went down on the ship and he said, you know, it has always bothered me. He came home, but he said, here's my poor family. My brother didn't come home. I came home. And Frank has had to live with that all his life. And now he's being told that the last resting place of his brother is being torn apart by people who have no ethics, and we have to stop this immediately.
Okay, Catherine Spurling, thanks very much. Let's just hope that something can be done to help preserve the memories of those who went down fighting on board HMAS Perth.
Definitely. Thank you very much.